Mountain, North Dakota, August 1898. The air, thick with the scent of cut hay and ripening wheat, held a promise of the bounty to come, but also a quiet threat of the winter that would follow. On a small rise overlooking the Tongue River Basin, a man was doing something that made his neighbors stop their wagons and stare. Sigfús Jónsson, a recent arrival from Iceland, was roofing his house with the prairie itself. His structure was already an oddity, a steep A-frame cabin pitched at a severe 45-degree angle, looking more like a tall, narrow wedge than a proper home. Now, with the frame sheathed, he was engaged in the back-breaking work of hoisting enormous squares of earth and turf onto its slopes. Each block was a solid 18 inches thick, dense with black soil and a tangled mat of living grass roots. Eldon Whitaker, the county building inspector, stood with his hands on his hips, a ledger under his arm. He had driven his buggy out from Pembina specifically to see the madness for himself. Beside him, Jedediah Mills, a carpenter who had built half the barns in the county, shook his head slowly, a wad of tobacco working in his cheek. "It's foolishness, plain and simple," Mills muttered, not bothering to keep his voice down. "He's putting a whole pasture on that roof. The weight alone—" Whitaker nodded, his expression one of professional concern rather than simple mockery. He had done the calculations. "I make it nearly 90 pounds per square foot, Jedediah. That's green weight. When the autumn rains come, it'll be more. His ridge beam is going to warp, I guarantee it. By the time the spring thaw hits, that whole sodden mass is going to slide right off. The man is building his family a tomb." The word spread through the small Icelandic colony and beyond. They called it Jonsson's Folly, the mud hat, the house that thinks it's a potato. Sigfús, stripped to the waist and slick with sweat, seemed oblivious. He worked with a quiet, methodical rhythm, placing each block of turf, grass side down, against a layer of glistening birch bark, fitting the seams with the precision of a stonemason. He heard the whispers, the laughter from the road. He just kept working. What did this Icelandic torfbear builder, this man who knew the living turf of Thingvellir, understand about the combined power of root mats and thermal mass that a professional county inspector, a man of slide rules and lumber tables, had so completely missed? This story is about a different kind of wisdom, a knowledge born not of textbooks, but of survival in a harsh land. It's a story of how old ways can solve new problems, and how sometimes the most radical innovation is simply a return to the earth itself. I promise that by the end of this, you will understand the profound physics behind a living roof, and why a blanket of dirt can be warmer than the thickest timber. If you find value in these forgotten histories of ingenuity, please consider subscribing to our channel and liking this video, and let us know in the comments, have you ever seen a green roof used in a truly cold climate? Sigfús Jónsson was not a farmer, though he now owned a quarter section of North Dakota soil. He was not a rancher, though he kept a milk cow and a pair of sturdy oxen. He was not a carpenter in the American sense, a man of saw-cut planks and wire nails. Sigfús was a builder of torfbear, the turf houses of his homeland. His hands were calibrated to a different set of materials. They knew the heft of turf blocks sliced from thousand-year-old bogs, the slick, papery feel of a birch bark membrane, the precise angle of foundation of river stone needed to shed the spring melt. He had spent his youth in the shadow of Thingvellir, where homes grew from the ground, their walls and roofs a living part of the landscape. His trade was not in conquering the elements, but in making them a partner. He had brought his wife, Margrethe, and their two small children, Jean and Eline, to America for the promise of land, a promise that Iceland, with its volcanic rock and stingy soil, could not make. They arrived in the mountain settlement, a cluster of Icelandic families carving a new life from the vast prairie, full of hope. Their first winter, in 1897, had shattered it. They had spent that winter in a standard frontier cabin, a single-walled structure of hastily felled cottonwood, the gaps chinked with mud and dried moss. It was a design celebrated for its speed of construction, a testament to the pioneer spirit of getting a roof over one's head before the first snow. But it was a sieve against the Dakota cold. That winter was a lesson in misery, a series of small, soul-crushing failures. Sigfús would never forget the sharp crack, like a pistol shot, when the iron handle of the milk pail Margrave was lifting, pulled clean from its rivet, the metal made brittle by the 30-degree air inside their own kitchen. He remembered finding the block of ground beef they'd bought in town, stored in their ice box in the corner, had frozen so hard it had split the tin liner of the box itself. The most unnerving memory was the candles. Margrave would light tallow candles in the evening, and they would watch as, over the course of an hour, the side of the candle facing the outer wall would soften from the heat of the flame, while the side facing the room stayed frozen solid. The candle would slowly bow, bending into a perfect arc, as if trying to flee the cold that radiated from the logs just inches away. They had huddled together, wrapped in every blanket they owned, burning through a mountain of wood, just to keep the frost from creeping across the floor. John had a cough that lasted from November to April. Eline's cries seemed thin and brittle in the frigid air. That winter, Sigfús had made a vow. He would not fight the cold with fire alone. He would build a shelter that held the warmth, a house that understood the winter. He would build as he knew how. The failure of the conventional frontier cabin was not a failure of material, but of philosophy. The American pioneer, flush with a seemingly endless supply of timber, built with an abundance of material but a poverty of thermal understanding. The standard cabin, like the one the Jonssons had endured and their neighbors still inhabited, was a study in heat's frantic escape. The primary culprit was not, as many assumed, simple conduction through the logs themselves. A thick log has some insulating value. The true enemy was air infiltration. A log cabin is a collection of seams. Every gap between the logs, every joint where wall met roof, every ill-fitting window frame was a tiny, relentless leak. The chinking, a mixture of clay, mud, and grass, would shrink and crack as it dried. In the deep cold, the logs themselves would contract, widening these cracks. The wind, that ever-present force on the prairie, would find everyone. Their neighbors, the Croft family, fought a losing battle against it. Silas Croft spent half his autumn days re-chinking his walls and his winter nights stuffing rags and bits of wool into new cracks that appeared as if by magic. His wife spoke of feeling a constant, imperceptible draft on the back of her neck, no matter where she sat. They burned through their woodpile at a terrifying rate, the stove glowing red-hot not for comfort, but for survival. Yet the heat it produced rose directly to the uninsulated rafters and bled out through the shake roof, while a permanent, ankle-deep layer of frigid, stagnant air pooled on the floor. It was in this layer that children played and families slept, a zone where the temperature was often only a few degrees warmer than the outside. The problem wasn't the fire in the stove. The problem was the house was a chimney. The very construction was a trap. The single-wall design meant the interior surface of the logs was always cold. Any moisture in the air, from breathing, from cooking, from boiling water for laundry, would immediately condense on the walls and freeze, coating the logs in a layer of icy crystals. This interior frost did more than chill the soul. It created a feedback loop. The ice would draw yet more heat from the room to fuel its slow sublimation, and its presence made the wall even colder, perpetuating the cycle. The frontier cabin was not a home. It was a beautifully crafted slow-motion physics experiment in thermal inefficiency. It was a machine for burning wood, with the unfortunate side effect of having people living inside it. Sigfús saw this not as a sign of poor craftsmanship, but as a fundamental misunderstanding of the enemy. The enemy was not the cold. The enemy was heat loss. In the late summer of 1898, Sigfús began to build his answer. He started not with logs, but with a foundation of heavy fieldstone, carefully laid to create a level base that rose a foot above the prairie grade. On this he built his A-frame. The design itself was a departure, a triangle 22 feet wide at its base, its two sides rising to a sharp peak. There were no vertical walls to catch the brunt of the prairie wind. The wind would flow over it like water over a smooth stone. The true genius, and the source of Eldon Whitaker's professional scorn, was in the framing. A standard roof might use 2x6 rafters spaced 24 inches apart. Sigfús used heavy 2x8s, and he doubled them, creating immensely strong beams. Then he spaced these doubled rafters only 16 inches apart. Jedediah Mills, stopping by one afternoon, ran his hand over the dense grid of lumber. "Building a railroad bridge, Jónsson?" he'd asked, a grin playing on his lips. "What in God's name are you planning to put up there that needs all this?" Sigfús, sighting down a rafter to check its line, didn't look up. "Wait," he said simply. Over the dense skeleton of rafters, he nailed rough-sawn sheathing. This is where a conventional builder would stop, ready for shingles or shakes. For Sigfús, this was merely the substrate. His next step truly baffled the onlookers. He and Margret spent a week harvesting birch bark from a stand of trees down by the river. They peeled it in wide, flexible sheets. Then, starting from the bottom edge of the roof, Sigfús began laying the bark, overlapping each sheet like a shingle. He was creating a waterproof, breathable membrane, a technique as old as the sagas. It was his vapor barrier, designed to protect the wooden structure from the moisture that would eventually be in his roof. Then came the sod. He didn't just dig up dirt. He chose a section of virgin prairie that had never seen a plow, a place where the grasses had interlocked their roots for 1,000 years. With a long-bladed spade he had forged himself, he cut the turf into large, rectangular blocks, each one a full 18 inches deep. The effort was immense. Each block weighed over 100 pounds, a dense, heavy mass of black earth and fibrous roots. Using his oxen and a system of ropes and pulleys, he hoisted each block to the roof. This was the moment that cemented his reputation as a fool. He was laying the sod grass side down. To the local farmers, this was lunacy. Everyone knew you laid sod grass side up if you wanted it to grow. Sigfús was deliberately placing the living part against the wood. Eldon Whitaker made his official visit during this phase. He arrived with his clipboard and a grave expression. He measured the thickness of the sod blocks, hefted a corner of one, and scribbled calculations. "Mr. Jónsson," he began, his tone formal, "I cannot in good conscience approve this structure. I've calculated the green weight of this sod, with its current moisture content, at approximately 90 pounds per square foot. Your rafters are robust, I'll grant you that, but no wooden ridge beam can sustain that kind of load through a freeze-thaw cycle without warping. Come April, when the frost leaves this mass, it will settle and shift. The sheer downward and outward pressure will spread your rafters and break your ridge. Your family will be under the open sky." Sigfús paused his work, wiping sweat from his brow with the back of his forearm. He looked at the inspector, then at the heavy block of earth he had just maneuvered into place. He gave a slight nod, acknowledging the man's logic. "It will hold," he said, his voice calm and low. He turned back to his work, nudging the block until its seam with the next was perfectly tight. Whitaker watched for another minute, a mixture of pity and frustration on his face, before turning and leaving. The mockery lasted for the rest of the summer. The validation would have to wait for the winter. To understand why Sigfús Jónsson was so confident and why Eldon Whitaker was so wrong, you have to look past the visible structure and understand the hidden physics at play. The A-frame was not just a heavy roof, it was a complex living system designed to manage heat in three distinct ways. First was the most obvious principle: thermal mass. Mass is a heat battery. The 18 inches of dense prairie sod, weighing nearly 95 pounds per cubic foot when wet, represented a colossal amount of mass. To change the temperature of this mass, either to heat it up or cool it down, required an enormous amount of energy. While a conventional cabin's thin walls and roof could cool down in minutes once the fire died, Sigfús's roof had immense thermal inertia. The short, pale sun of a Dakota winter day might not feel warm, but its radiant energy would be soaked up by the dark earth of the roof all day long. As the temperature plummeted at night, the roof would slowly release this stored energy, not as a blast of heat, but as a steady, stable buffer against the encroaching cold. It slowed the rate of temperature change from hours to days. Second was insulation, measured in R value. This is where the genius of the grass-down placement became clear. The sod itself, a mixture of soil and organic matter, had a decent R value of about R0.5 per inch, giving the 18-inch layer a total of R9. This was already better than a wood-shake roof, but the real magic was in the root mat. By placing the grass side down, Sigfús was tricking the plant. The roots, instead of growing down into darkness, now found themselves on top. Seeking moisture and nutrients from the sod block above, they began to grow and re-knit, weaving themselves into the adjacent blocks. Over the course of the autumn, this process created a continuous, unified layer of dense, fibrous roots across the entire roof, about 3 inches thick. This living, breathing felt was an incredible insulator, with an R value of at least R2 per inch. That added another R6 to the system. Combined, the roof had a total R value of R15, a number unheard of on the frontier, rivaling modern insulated ceilings. The roof wasn't just a pile of dirt. It was a self-healing, high-performance insulation blanket. But the third principle was the most subtle, a secret weapon drawn from the laws of thermodynamics. It was the principle of latent heat. Whitaker saw the moisture in the sod as a liability, adding dangerous weight. Sigfús knew it was an active part of his heating system. When water turns to ice, it undergoes a phase change. This process, called the latent heat of fusion, releases a surprising amount of energy. For every pound of water that freezes, 2 BTUs of heat are released into its immediate surroundings. As the brutal winter cold descended, the outer layer of the sod roof would begin to freeze. But as the water in that layer turned to ice, it would release latent heat downwards into the next layer of sod. This process created a dynamic thermal buffer. The freezing process on the outside was actively, if minutely, warming the layers below it. It was like having a slow-burning, low-temperature chemical reaction taking place just inches above his living space. It wouldn't keep the outer surface from freezing, but it dramatically slowed the frost line's penetration into the roof's deep profile. This was the knowledge Sigfús carried from Iceland, a land where survival depends on understanding the subtle energies of ice and earth. He hadn't just built a heavy roof. He had built a self-insulating, heat-storing, phase-changing thermal engine. The autumn of 1898 turned with a sharp edge. A cold snap in October laid a hard frost on the fields. November brought the first significant snow, blanketing the prairie in a uniform sheet of white. Sigfús's cabin, with its dark, earthy roof, became a strange, snow-covered pyramid, its steep sides shedding the powder almost as quickly as it fell. The real test, everyone knew, was yet to come. It arrived in January. They called it the Red River Polar Vortex. An immense dome of Arctic high pressure settled over the northern plains, pushing a mass of brutally cold, dry air down from the pole. For 16 consecutive nights, the temperature at mountain dropped to 38 Terangstig, and during the day it struggled to rise above 20 degrees. The sun became a pale, distant disk in a steel-gray sky, offering light but no warmth. The air was so still and dense that sound traveled for miles. Hoarfrost, fed by the slightest trace of moisture in the air, grew on every exposed surface, covering fence wire and dead weeds with spectacular 4-inch needle crystals of ice. For the settlers in their conventional cabins, it was a period of intense suffering. At the Croft farm, the battle was constant. Their windows were coated in a thick, opaque layer of ice on the inside, patterns of ferns and leaves traced by the frozen breath of the occupants. They abandoned all but one room, the kitchen, hanging blankets over the doorways to concentrate the stove's meager output. Silas and his oldest son took turns staying up through the night to feed the fire, a constant hungry beast that devoured their carefully stacked woodpile. Even so, a bucket of water left 10 feet from the stove would be frozen solid by morning. Life shrank to a small circle of warmth, a desperate defense against an enemy that was already inside the walls. Inside Sigfús Jonsson's A-frame, the world was different. The first thing a visitor would notice was the quiet. The howling prairie wind, which rattled the doors and whistled through the chinking of every other home, was a distant, muffled whisper here. The 18 inches of earth absorbed the sound as effectively as it absorbed the cold. The air inside was still. A candle flame stood perfectly erect, not flickering or bending toward some unseen draft. The warmth was not the scorching, dry heat of an overworked stove, but a gentle, pervasive comfort that filled the entire volume of the house. A single small cast-iron stove fed with a modest amount of wood kept the interior at a stable temperature. Margaret found she could go about her daily chores with an ease that felt like a forgotten luxury. She could leave a pat of butter on a shelf across the room, and it remained soft and spreadable. The smell of her baking bread filled the entire space, a warm, yeasty aroma that wasn't immediately sucked away by drafts. The children, John and Eileen, could play on the floor in the center of the room in their woolen socks, their coats hung on pegs by the door. The ultimate proof of the home's unique environment was a quiet, domestic process. Margaret, like many Icelandic women, made skyr, a cultured dairy product similar to yogurt. It required a consistent, gentle warmth over a long period for the cultures to work properly. In any other cabin, it was an impossible task in winter. The milk would freeze, or the temperature would fluctuate too wildly. In the A-frame, Margaret set her earthenware crock, wrapped in a cloth, on a low shelf built into the interior wall. It was nowhere near the stove. Day after day, through the worst of the polar vortex and into the deep freeze of Lent, the skyr cultured perfectly, developing its characteristic thick texture and tangy flavor. While her neighbors found their milk crocks frozen solid, the expanding ice splitting the pottery and cracking the glaze, Margaret's skyr was a quiet, living testament to the house's success. It proved that the cabin wasn't just surviving the winter, it was creating its own gentle, stable climate, a small island of normalcy in a sea of brutal cold. The vindication, when it came, was not delivered by a scientific instrument or a published report. It was delivered by the simple, undeniable evidence of touch, experienced by the very man who had been the innovation's most prominent critic. In late February, with the polar vortex having finally broken, but the land still locked in deep winter, Eldon Whitaker set out from Pembina in his horse-drawn cutter. He had quarterly building surveys to file and reports to deliver across the county. The temperature was a balmy 15 degrees. The cold had made every piece of metal in his world brittle and unforgiving. As he navigated a frozen rut on the trail that led past the Icelandic settlement, he heard a sharp, resonant crack from beneath him, The cutter lurched violently to one side. A leaf spring on the axle had snapped clean in two. He was miles from the nearest town, his horse tired. He looked around, surveying his options. In the distance, rising from the flat snow-blown prairie, he saw the strange, pyramidal shape of Jonsson's Folly. It was the only shelter for at least an hour's walk. Cursing his luck, Whitaker unhitched his horse and began the slow, cold trek towards the sod-roofed house. He trudged through the snow, his mind filled with a grim sense of duty. He expected to find a family in dire straits, huddled and miserable. A grim confirmation of his professional judgment. He steeled himself for what he might find inside. As he drew closer, he saw that the steep 45-degree pitch of the roof had done its job. While the surrounding prairie lay under 2 feet of snow, the roof itself was largely bare, especially on the east-facing slope, which was sheltered from the prevailing wind. Exhausted from his walk, Whitaker reached the structure and leaned his shoulder against this exposed slope to catch his breath. And then he felt it. The Vindication scene technique was about to unfold. He expected to feel an instant, biting cold through his thick wool coat, the same deep, petrifying chill of a frozen rock or a tree trunk. He braced for the shock of contact with a surface that was 15 degrees F. Instead, what he felt through the fabric was nothing. A profound neutrality. There was no aggressive cold leaching the heat from his body. Puzzled, he pulled off his heavy mitten. He pressed his bare palm flat against the tightly knit turf of the roof. The sensation was stunning. He expected the instant pain of contact with a frozen surface, the feeling of his skin wanting to stick to the ice. What he actually felt was a cool, damp, earthy texture, completely free of frost. It wasn't warm like a living thing, but it was utterly devoid of the winter's killing cold. It felt like pressing his hand to the flank of a great, sleeping animal. Under his palm, he could feel the dense, unyielding mass of the earth, holding a deep, latent stillness against the fury of the Arctic air. At that moment, the door of the A-frame opened. A wave of gentle, humid warmth washed over him, carrying the scent of coffee and wood smoke. Sigfús Jónsson stood in the doorway, regarding him with a calm, questioning look. Whitaker stumbled forward, past Sigfús, and into the impossible warmth of the cabin. His eyes, accustomed to the harsh glare of the snow, struggled to adjust. He saw Margrethe by the stove, and then he saw the children, John and Eline, sitting on a rug on the wooden floor, playing with carved wooden toys. They were in their shirt sleeves. Whitaker's face, already pale from the cold, drained of all remaining color. He stared from the comfortable children to the small, placid stove, then looked back towards the roof he had just touched, his mind struggling to reconcile the evidence of his senses with a lifetime of professional experience. He was a man of rules, of calculations, of proven methods. All of it had just been invalidated by the feeling of his palm against a patch of dirt. He didn't apologize. An apology was insufficient for the scale of his misjudgment. Instead, a new understanding dawned. His voice was a raw whisper, cracking with cold and astonishment. "My God, Jónsson," he said, his gaze sweeping the warm, secure space. "You didn't build a roof. You built a hillside?" Eldon Whitaker was a man of integrity. Having been proven so spectacularly wrong, he did not retreat into silence or resentment. He became the innovation's most fervent and credible advocate. On his next trip to Pembina, and in every town hall and general store he visited thereafter, he spoke of the Jónsson house. He described the feel of his palm on the unfrozen turf, the sight of the children playing on the floor, the jar of Skyr culturing on the shelf. Because the testimony came from him, the county inspector, the man of regulation and skepticism, it carried immense weight. The story spread. It was the talk of the Icelandic communities, which were tightly knit by language and culture. The crucial step in its wider dissemination, however, came via the primary vehicle for news and ideas in the scattered diaspora, the Lögberg Heimskringla, the Icelandic language weekly newspaper published out of Winnipeg, Manitoba. An editor, hearing the tale from a cousin in the mountain settlement, wrote to Whitaker for confirmation. To his immense credit, Whitaker provided not just a glowing testimonial, but the technical specifications he had once derided. He detailed the necessity of the doubled 2x8 rafters, the 16-inch spacing, and the 90-pound per square foot load rating. Most importantly, he included Sigfús' critical and counterintuitive instruction. The sod must be laid grass side down to encourage the roots to reknit. In May of 1899, the paper ran a full article describing the Jónsson method, complete with diagrams of the rafter construction and a detailed explanation of the turf-laying process. The impact was immediate and profound. For the Icelandic settlers, this was not a foreign, alien idea, but a brilliant adaptation of a familiar one. It was the torf bear of their homeland, reimagined for the timber-rich, soil-deep prairie. That summer and autumn, a wave of construction began. By the time the first snows of 1899 fell, 11 families across Pembina and Cavalier counties had built their own sod-capped A-frames, following the specifications printed in the newspaper. The next winter, their stories mirrored the Jónssons: reduced fuel consumption, stable indoor temperatures, and an end to the miserable, drafty existence they had once accepted as the price of life on the frontier. What Sigfús Jónsson accomplished on that windy rise in North Dakota was more than building a warm house. He was, without the language of modern science, anticipating principles that would become foundational to high performance, building a century later. His steeply pitched A-frame was a masterclass in aerodynamic design, minimizing wind load and shedding snow. His use of doubled rafters was a practical application of structural engineering to handle the immense static load of the thermal mass. The layer of birch bark was perhaps the most prescient element. It functioned as a vapor-permeable air barrier, a concept that today's building science community obsesses over. It stopped air leakage but allowed moisture to diffuse through, preventing the rot that would have destroyed a structure sealed with an impermeable material like tar paper. The 18-inch roof of living sod was a precursor to the modern green roof movement, but implemented not for ecological aesthetics, but for raw thermal performance. He was practicing the concepts of super insulation and thermal massing decades before those terms were ever coined. He had built a passive house before the word passive had ever been applied to a home. It was a structure that worked not by consuming massive amounts of fuel, but by intelligently managing the natural energy flows of its environment. The neighbors who mocked Sigfús Jónsson saw the world as a battle. Winter was an enemy to be fought, an invading force to be held at bay with thicker walls and bigger fires. Their mindset was one of conflict. They built fortresses and then spent the winter shivering inside them, besieged. Theirs was a story of resistance. Sigfús operated from a different philosophy, one born from a landscape where trees were scarce and the earth itself was the primary building material. He did not see the winter as an enemy to be defeated, but as a condition to be understood and harmonized with. He knew that life itself, the stubborn, tangled energy of prairie grass roots, the immense thermal stability of the soil, held a power that was quiet, but immense. He didn't build a barrier to shut the cold out. He enlisted a living piece of the Dakota prairie, gave it a structure to lie down upon, and trusted it to keep his family safe. He didn't roof his cabin against the cold. He taught a meadow to lie down on his rafters and keep growing. While his neighbors fought a war with the elements, Sigfús struck a partnership. His house was not an act of defiance against the Dakota winter. It was an act of communion with it. And in that quiet collaboration between an ancient craft and a new land, he found not just survival, but a deep and profound warmth. Thank you for joining us for this story of frontier ingenuity. If you believe this kind of knowledge deserves to be remembered, please support our channel by liking this video and subscribing for more stories. We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. What other old-world building techniques do you know of that could solve modern problems? Disclaimer: this video presents historically inspired reconstructions for educational and storytelling purposes. The characters, names, and specific events depicted are fictional, but the techniques and scientific principles are based on real historical practices. Any application of these or similar techniques today should be undertaken only after consulting with qualified professionals and in accordance with all current building codes, safety guidelines, and local regulations. This content does not constitute professional, technical, or legal advice.